talking government procurement with a crazy bill called
I'm back from the western Appalachian mountainside of North Carolina. Hello to our friends of the show over there. You know who you are. We welcome you to rainy Austin, Texas, as it's now officially too late, by the way, for Trump or Clinton to respond to our invitations to the show. That ship has sailed. I'm Bill Colhane, sitting next to Tony Callis. We appreciate you voting us as one of the favorite business/finance podcasts in the US of A. Tony, let's not hesitate. As our listeners know, things move quickly on the show. Maybe you're not as big a fan as Bill Murray, Tony, but you have to be proud of your Chicago Cubs. No, your world champion Chicago Cubs. I see you smiling.
Yeah, no, 104 years. It's about time. That's all I got to say about that. Go Cubs.
And no, I wasn't alive the last time the Cubs won the World Series, by the way, just to clarify that. Now, in this episode, we visit with a guy who has done much. He was a spy, is an author, CIA, university professor, info security expert, chief privacy officer in the private sector. He's worked for the esteemed Berkeley Research Group and Cisco. With all the recent discussion and buzz surrounding cyber terrorism, information security, hacking, etc., we wanted to weigh in as well. And as always, Tony will close the curtain on this episode with a crazy bids that you can win. This season, we're humble in saying we have had some remarkable guests on the show. No doubt a topic that has reached the highest levels of government, highest levels of business. This side of the U.S. presidential election, cyber terror is arguably the hottest topic out there. Dr. Lance Hayden joins us. I've already touched on his background, and Lance will go into a little more detail in a moment. Just know this. At our production meetings for each topic, Tony, myself, we always sit down with our staff and put together what we call our great guest list, meaning the top 5 people in the world who we want to ask on the show. Because of his background and reputation, Lance was number 1 on our list for this show. As they call around Lauren and Christina, sometimes I help out. We don't always get number 1, but this time we did. Here's part 1. Part 2 is on next week's show. Part 1 of our visit with Lance Hayden. As we welcome in Dr. Lance Hayden onto the show, I'm sure some of our listeners have seen this movie, but just last night, and I'm not a big TV movie type guy, but I watched Live Free or Die Hard. Bruce Willis's movie came out back in 2007, and basically the movie is about a group that attempted to shut down the U.S. by attacking the country's computer infrastructure. And so as we bring Lance onto the show, Lance, what can you tell our audience about your background when it comes to cyber protection of information technology infrastructure? Basically, I guess my question is, what led you into the information security field after you started your career once upon a time as a human intelligence officer at the CIA?
Great. Well, Bill, I want to thank you for having me on the podcast. And let me just start out with I love Live Free or Die Hard. I'm a huge Bruce Willis and fan of the Die Hard movies. And the interesting thing, those movies are obviously they're obviously fiction. They're obviously sort of metaphors for things. But I find it really interesting. One of the ones I've watched recently, going back even farther in the Wayback Machine, is Enemy of the State with Will Smith. And
Yes.
What's interesting about some of these movies is at the time that we watched them, they've kind of come across as almost over the top silly. And when I go back and watch some of them now, it's almost a little disturbing how some of the things that they've kind of predicted, if you will, even from this sort of fictionalized sense, are things that we're starting to see. It's that classic trope of science fiction becoming reality over time. And that's not to say that these things are documentaries by any stretch of the word yet. But it is interesting in watching them and seeing some of the issues that maybe even a few years ago we thought there seemed very, very far-fetched, now seem disturbingly real. And so, it's interesting asking, going to the question about what led me into this. It was a piece of fiction, to be perfectly honest. I was an English major as an undergrad. I didn't have a computer. Not when I went to college. That computers were still a hobby kind of things. But I was one of these ones that sort of thought they were a fad and didn't really get into them until I had started my professional career. And what really started me off on the track is I read a novel by a classic cyberpunk author named William Gibson called Neuromancer. And it was all about hackers, and he coined the term cyberspace. So, it was very early on in this sort of fictionalized world of what the internet was going to do and what our technologies were going to look like, and sort of the initial thoughts about what security was going to mean in that space. And I was hooked. I read that and I'm like, I got to get into this. And so that's one of the things that drove me back to grad school, is I wanted to learn more. I as an intelligence officer, and this was important too, and it's remained important. I've been in this industry for over 25 years now. And I started out with this kind of understanding of security as first and foremost a people problem, a people-centric problem. Matter of fact, my latest book is People-Centric Security, and that's been something that I've always put people instead of, say, technology front and center. And inside the security space, we always talk about security as a people, process, and technology challenge. But over the decades that I've been doing this, what I found in my experience is we often move further down the line towards the technology side. That's where we put a lot of our effort and a lot of our resources. And that's starting to change because we're realizing that, especially as these infrastructures that we have to protect start becoming more social, it's a people-centric technology world. And so people have become front and center to the idea of security and protecting it. And that has driven me my entire career. It's what got me into it, and it's what's kept me going and keeps me going today.
There are different conversations today when it comes to protection of information, protection of data, than there were when I started my professional career 25 years ago or so. Lance, you've written extensively, and keep in mind that as far as our audience goes, we have a number of business owners tuned in, and also those who work in government, small, medium, large-size business owners. What exactly is an enterprise security culture?
So an enterprise security culture, is a species or a subcomponent of a general organizational culture. I talk about culture, usually the way I describe it is, and it's helpful to don't start thinking about enterprise security culture first. Think about culture in general. And when I talk about culture, we're not talking about culture, although there's overlaps, in the way that sort of anthropologists or something talk about culture, and we talk about going around the world and seeing different cultures and stuff. It's a little bit different. What we talk about is we're really focused more on organizational culture or corporate culture, which again is related, but it's sort of a separate discipline. But what we talk about when we talk about an enterprise or a corporate culture or an organizational culture is it's an iceberg principle, if you will. And one of the best definitions for it was an organizational cultural scholar named Shine. He explained it really succinctly. The culture is just the way we do things around here. And that's always been one of my favorite definitions for it. And it's easily recognizable to anybody that's ever talked about, experienced, or even complained about the culture of the organization that they work in. And that's because what happens is in an organizational culture, it's an iceberg principle. And what that means is there's some parts of it you can see above the surface, but most of it's what's going on underneath the waves. And what you can see above the surface are the visible artifacts of an organizational culture, things like how people treat one another, how they dress, the organizational rituals, and whether, is the organizational very bureaucratic, or is it very, very kind of loose and fast and free with the way it does business? Is it a friendly environment? Is it like a startup or an entrepreneurial environment, or is it more of a bureaucratic? You talked about some of the folks that are in the audience for the podcast. Government tends to have a different organizational culture than a small business or a startup for a lot of different reasons. But what's going on under the surface that drives those visible kind of attributes is the things like what we believe in, the values that we have, the rituals and stories that we tell. It's all the things that, again, as I said before, culture starts with people. And so one of the analogies I use to really understand the difference between culture and technology is if you threw all your technology out the window tonight, when you came to work tomorrow morning, you would still have an organization and you would still have a culture, because an organization is the product of people working together primarily. If you fire everybody tonight, then it doesn't matter what kind or what your technology culture is or what kind of technologies you have in place. No one's going to show up for work in the morning. So there is no more organization. There is no more culture anymore. So security and organizations and enterprise cultures, all of these different things, primarily are the way people interact and what they believe in and what they do to sort of make where they work a place that they get involved in and that they share information, they communicate, they collaborate, they have rituals, they have beliefs, they have all of these things that enable them to work together, and it has a very specific feeling. It also has very specific effects in terms of how well the organization performs in the environment in which it exists.
A moment ago, Lance, you talked about the iceberg principle and what we can see above the waterline. Well, everybody listening to this podcast knows that there's been a lot of relevant type discussion in the news recently about hacking, cyber terror, protection of information. Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's likely that the mainstream media, governments aren't disclosing everything that's going on behind the recent cyber attacks. How were John Podesta's emails hacked is one question. Well, what can the ordinary citizen, Jane Q. public, what can they learn? What can they do to protect themselves from a similar intrusion, say, that John Podesta went through?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And, in terms of what the media or what the government may or may not be disclosing, what you run into there is you run into smack dab head on into the full complexity of this entire issue. And it is extremely hard for anybody, even experts in the field, to completely, to know everything about what's going on. You've got problems of attribution is a big one in terms of some of these attacks. And what that simply means is we have a very hard time figuring out or proving. We can suspect, we can look at it, and we have a lot of circumstantial evidence. But at the end of the day, even for some of the most sophisticated players in this space, it gets really difficult to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt who did what, where an attack came from, who was behind it. There's a lot of different ways to hide who you are whenever you're doing stuff like this. So, that's one of the challenges around just when we think that, when we get the feeling that it's really hard to figure out what's going on, that's because it is really hard to figure out what's going on. It's not just because we're victims of a misinformation campaign or the media is not doing their job or the government's hiding stuff from us. In many cases, it's because it's just, in some cases, almost impossible to tell with 100% certainty. Now, to your question about what can people do to protect themselves, this gets into an entirely sort of different set of complexities. And one of the problems and challenges, if you will, of all of the wonderful technology that we have adopted and that we're using to make our lives easier, to make our lives more social and collaborative, to make our lives more fun, and to improve our leisure activities and stuff, that technology comes with a cost. And there are outright costs that we all see. You go buy a piece of software, you go sign up for a service online, you pay for it. That's a very outright cost. You're paying. It's up front. It's right in your face, and it's clear and transparent for the most part. Now, there's a lot of hidden costs, though, and this is the way that, any technology, and it's not just digital technology, but throughout the years as industry and corporations have adopted new technologies, we've always run into the sense that, okay, we bought this, and, we didn't think about this, and that's actually costing us as well. Security and some of the issues and technologies and concerns around security in many ways can be looked at as one of these sorts of hidden costs. When you buy into something like this, when you sign up for that social network or you buy that new piece of software, you also have responsibility for protecting yourself and maybe even others when you use it. And that is not something that's always written in the manual. And it's something, though, that we only sort of face when we start seeing these attacks and when we start seeing some of these problems that are arising. So one of the first ways that I think that our society in general, not just individuals, not just companies, but the whole society as we go digital, especially as we move into technologies like Internet of Things and stuff that are just going to exponentially hook us up even more. If you think you're hooked up and socially networked now, wait till Internet of Things really, really gets going and everything is on the network and talking to everyone else. That's going to require sort of a paradigm shift in the way that we look at how we interface with these technologies and what our responsibilities are for using them. And that goes for individuals, that goes for companies, and that goes for governments.
If you're just now joining us, this is Tony Callis with the Big Bid Theory, and we're with Dr. Lance Hayden. This kind of rolls us into the next question, Dr. Hayden. I hear the term social engineering as a new type of hacking. What is it exactly?
So first of all, it's not new. It's incredibly old. The only thing, it's one of the oldest types of hacking because it predates anything technological. Social engineering is, in a sense, tricking someone into doing something you want for your own interest at the expense of theirs. And so social engineering is the same phenomenon that has been going on since the first con man or crook talked someone into giving them their money without really knowing why they were doing it or having it in their best interest to do so. So social engineering has become sort of a term of art in security because it's an attack form. Now, again, even in security, I've been in this almost a quarter of a century, and social engineering was a problem when I first joined. And what it was is it was people calling up and saying, hey, this is the vice president of the company, and I'm locked out of my system. I want you to reset my password. And so someone's like, well, how do I know it's you? Well, because I'm going to come in there and fire you if you don't do it. I need it now. And, okay, I'm afraid of the VP, so I do it. So, it's been all the way back from phone-based attacks and social engineering of people trying to, get in through a door that they shouldn't be able to get into. What you're seeing with social engineering today is that it's gotten a lot more sophisticated and leveraged technology more and more to be able to have it happen. And so it's behind, another term you'll often hear is phishing attacks or spear phishing attacks or whaling attacks, things like that. These are an automated form of social engineering where someone sends you an email that looks like an email from your bank or from some other place that you trust or you're just not thinking correctly. And it fools you into clicking on a link or opening up a file or doing something in that email that is actually not what it appears to be. And when you click on that link or you open it up or you hit a particular website or whatever you end up doing, what happens is then you open yourself up to a hacker that is able to come in and steal information or is able to come in and install malware or, enlist you in a botnet to take over your computer or any number of malicious activities. Now, there are some very sophisticated ways of doing that today that are cutting edge, but the fundamental principle of social engineering has been around forever. It's been around longer, that I started out my career as a spy. Being a spy has a lot to do with social engineering, regardless of whether or not you're doing anything technological.
Stay tuned next week. I'll be in Honolulu next week promoting the show and also taking care of some other business, but we'll return for part 2 with Lance. He's going to cover what businesses should be doing about the threat and what may be in store in the future as it applies to cyber terrorism. It ain't going away, folks. Let me just say that. By now, go to the podcast description for details on how to potentially connect with and or follow Lance. With no further ado, Tony, how is your episodally dose of crazy bids gone? Is episodally a word, by the way? Anyway, Tony, what have you and your crack staff come up with this time around?
Well, Bid Prime listeners, you're going to be excited about this one.
I'm excited.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture released a bid for 180 tons of basically cow lactation premix.
No. Say that again.
Cow lactation premix. Essentially, basically the feed that goes to cattle in their first stage of while they're lactating, while these mothers are lactating to their calves. I know it's not the craziest bid, but it was the craziest bid we could find this week.
No, that's crazy.
I agree.
It proves yet again, and you and I talk about it all the time when we're sitting down with the production staff, we talk about it. It is amazing. We have a guest on talking about cyber terror, and clearly governments at all levels, city, state, local, county, federal, military, you name it, all investing in cyber terror solutions. And so, Tony, you've got a smile on your face. You come up with a bid for cow lactation.
We're talking about cow lactation premix.
So a bid that you can win.
essentially. Yeah.
And it comes from the USDA. So
180 tons. That's a lot of premix.
So that's a lot of premix. So for you folks out there who are in that vertical, in that industry, best of luck to you. And also, thank you. Thanks so much for downloading, sharing, and following the show. Of course, we're also on Facebook and LinkedIn. You can keep up with what's going on, not just on the show, but also around the show. Exit Poll Show, it does a body good to like our Facebook page, connect with us on LinkedIn. I saw that on Fox, MSNBC, or somewhere earlier this week. Tony, winter's coming. I'll send you a postcard from Waikiki. And by the way, again, I'm going there on business and also to visit with some friends of the Big Bid Theory.
That's a good way to get a good tax write-off.
Thank you very much. Well, keep emailing us at bcallhane@bidprime.com or tcallis@bidprime.com. And as you know, for those of you who have emailed us in the past, we respond as quickly as possible. Sometimes, of course, other events may slow us down, but we do appreciate the emails. And I saw Tony responding to a listener on the show the other day. On the Twitterverse, go to @TheBigBidTheory. My Twitter handle is contract_hunter. Tony is found, as many of you know, Tony is found at Anthony Callis. That's not at Tony Callis, but at Anthony Callis. There's been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears shed so that you can vote. Folks, all I'm going to say is exercise your right if you haven't already done so. I think many of us agree. I'm not super excited about either candidate either, but those Americans who stormed the beaches at Normandy and fought at Antietam weren't thrilled about their choices either. Lance Hayden is back next week. Tony is back with Crazy Bids, and I'm back for a few days before my next trip. On behalf of our TBBT staff, staring at their Bruce Willis poster in the control room, for Tony Callis, I'm Bill Colhane. Until next time, go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and World Champion Cubs, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.
Talking government procurement.